No questions? We'll move on to chapter 15 then. And let me advance the slide. There we go. So, Judges chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. Later on, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going to my wife's room. But her father would not let him go in. I was so sure you hated her, he said, that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead. Samson said to them, This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them. So he went out and he caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and the standing grain together with the vineyards and olive groves. When the Philistines asked who did this, they were told Samson, the Timnite's son in law, because his wife was given to his companion. So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Samson said to them, Since you have acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down to stayed in a cave in the rock at Etam. So, starting with that very first verse, we can see that Samson still doesn't appreciate this new wife. I'll tell you why. It's right there on the screen for you. He brings her a young goat. All the way back in Genesis 38, in the story of Judah and his daughter in law Tamar, um, it talks about, well, I put on there, it's a very long story, it's a very involved story. Let's keep it short. Tamar is his daughter in law. That means she's married to his son. She was widowed, and was sent to live in Timnah with her father. After Judah's wife died, he travels to Timnah to see the men that are shearing his sheep. Tamar conceals her identity from him. He sees her, thinks she's a prostitute, and asks to sleep with her. She asks what he will pay. He says, a young goat. This scripture passage is linked directly to the story of Samson. He brings his bride a young goat as if she's a prostitute. This whole situation gets worse, though, when her father explains that he thought that Samson had divorced her. When he walked away and left her alone, that's divorce in that culture. He had to say, or he had to give her up and have nothing else to do with her. That's what it seemed like. So that's why he gave her to the companion. To try and smooth things over, the father gives Samson the other, or offers Samson the other daughter. He doesn't have any interest. He's mad. The situation is made irreparable because of the giving of the wife to the companion. She's now married to the other man and cannot return to Samson under any condition. If Samson claims he never divorced her, the problem is compounded because she then becomes an adulteress. So Samson cannot have what he wants and seeks vengeance by burning their crops in another amazing feat. I don't know about you, but I don't think I could capture one fox, much less 300. Foxes are kind of fast and tricky, but he catches 300 foxes and ties them tail to tail in pairs and sets a blazing torch in between the tails and sets them off running. And they burn everything that they come into contact with, the fields, the vineyards, the olive groves. Um, and then the Philistines take their revenge and do exactly what they threatened the bride with when they were back at the riddle. They threatened to burn her and her father and her family. Now they've gone back and they've actually done it because of Samson's act of revenge, burning their crops. So this probably is a perfect example of why we don't seek revenge. Because Samson wanted revenge, and then the Philistines wanted revenge, and now Samson is getting revenge for the revenge for the revenge. And it just keeps building and building and building. So Samson attacks the Philistines viciously. He slaughters a lot of them and runs off and hides. Any questions so far? I don't see mute coming off anywhere, so we'll move on. Chapter 15, verses 9 through 20. The Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The people of Judah asked, "Why have you come to fight us?" "We have come to take Samson prisoner," they answered, "to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock at Edom and said to Samson, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He answered, "I merely did to them what they did to me." Then they said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson said, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "So we will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward them shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, you have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. When Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En Hakor, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Okay. Anything in there that you want to discuss before we start looking at the map? I don't blame you. Let me see. All right. So this area right here, Dan, as it's not actually mentioned in the story in the scripture, but as I went through commentaries and Bible maps, they said that Samson came from around this area. You see down here is Philistia, and that's this whole section over here is Judah. Now each of these are named their tribes of Judah, tribes of Israel. Judah is a tribe, it's also a person. But Lehi is going to be down in this area. I couldn't find a map that actually listed where Timnah was and where Lehi was, but the Philistines went way into Judah. It wasn't just right across the border or anything like that. It was quite a distance that they marched to find Samson. So turn the laser pointer back off. All right. So Samson goes to hide at Etam, um, which is in the territory of the tribe of Judah. And when the Philistines move into Judah and set up camp, the Judahites ask, Why? Why are you here? I'm sure that they're terrified that this army of Philistines are there to attack them. Um, this part of the story, well, first off, the tribe of Judah gathers 3,000 men and sends them after Samson. It's probably a good idea. If they just sent one or two, they probably wouldn't have come back. 3,000 men marched to Edom to gather up Samson. And this part of the story introduces the idea that Samson's actions affect more than just Samson. So far, he's just been thinking about himself. But I believe he's starting to realize that this is bigger than just him. Um, so he doesn't want to use his great strength against his own countrymen, his own people. So he agrees to let them hand him over to the Philistines. When they get there, the Philistines rush to get him. And the Spirit of the Lord empowers Samson once again. We've seen that several times now. The ropes that bind him burn away. Um, you guys know what flax is. It's a very soft, um, I guess material would be the best thing to say. Very soft. It would burn up quickly, and that's what it said that the ropes became, was like burned flax or charred flax. Once they burn away, he finds a donkey's jawbone, and he slays 1,000 of the Philistines with it. That's a pretty big feat. Um, a donkey's jawbone is going to be fairly big, but it wouldn't make a wonderful weapon. Um, in Hebrew, Lehi means jawbone, and Ramoth Lehi is jawbone's height. So that's what that meant when they mentioned that name. So the next part is interesting. Samson speaks directly to God. The original text doesn't speak of calling out to God the way most of the others have done. The Israelites, every time that they become captured by another group, they call out to God. Sounds more like a prayer. Um, this is, though, Samson speaking directly to God. And here the Hebrew indicates, well, like it says, like I just said, he's speaking directly to God, just like their buddies. Um, and if that isn't enough, God responds. He opens up the hollow place, the creek starts flowing from it, and Hekor literally means spring of the caller. And so they say that the spring still exists today. That would be whenever the original writer wrote that story. Um, and this is the end of the chapter. So, uh, as if the connection to God gives permission, the writer now tells us Samson judged Israel for 20 years. Um, this isn't the end of Samson's story, but the next chapter was much longer than we could do tonight. So I wanted to stop with this. Was there anything in this chapter or in previous chapters that you wanted to talk about or have questions about? We can kind of work through answers.
I had a question.
Sure.
Um, so, like, was God okay with everything that he just done? Like, I don't see why he would have let him become the judge for Israel after all of that.
Yeah. Well, I think that this whole thing is God's plan. Um, the that's why Samson was to be a Nazarite from before birth. That's why the angel told his mother that he would be consecrated from birth. Um, God's plan spans throughout this entire story. Um, all the way down to marrying outside of his people, outside of his race. He wanted to intermarry. He wanted to have this Philistine woman, and God was okay with it because it was his plan, God's plan. So all of this, I think that this is exactly what God intends to happen. Um, we've probably all heard about
Okay.
Samson and Delilah. That's where we're going to be next week. We'll talk about Samson and Delilah. Um, any other questions or thoughts?
Hey, Jim,
Yes.
um, when when all of the he's doing all of these things against what God's telling him to do,
Yes.
it seems like that nowadays sometimes we do the same thing. God's got a plan for us, and we're just out there doing, we're not listening, we're not following, we're not doing what he's asking us to do. And yet, because of his, because of, like, nowadays time, because of God's grace through Jesus, now all of a sudden we're forgiven for some of the things that we do.
Mm-hmm.
We go and we ask for forgiveness, but it seems like with Samson that he just kept kind of, kind of given God the
He's
I don't know
marching
how to
to his
explain
own
it, but just
drummer.
kind of, yeah, thank you. That's exactly, yeah. And yet God is still, because he's got this plan for him, he's still kind of letting him, get into trouble and find out that the trouble is, going to cause more trouble because of all of these times that he went back and did all this revenge and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it amazes me sometimes how God is so willing, to forgive, to let us, to let us mess up and mess up and mess up. And yet when we go back and we ask for forgiveness, we get it.
Right.
I wonder if, do you think Samson knew from the very beginning when he was little that God had planned, had a plan for him? Like, did the mom, because I have only just been in on tonight's, but did his mom like talk to him about these plans? Does it ever say anything about that?
I'm sure it doesn't actually mention it, but I mean
Yeah,
the angel of the Lord visited her before she was even pregnant with him, and told him that she was
yeah,
going to have she was going to have a son, and that he was going to serve God. So I'm sure as he was being raised, they never cut
yeah,
his hair, which was part of the deal. Being a Nazarite, they don't
yeah,
cut their hair. Um,
yeah,
that I'm sure the thing about keeping away from anything that has to do with grapes, um,
yeah.
all of
And the
those
dead
things,
bodies. Yeah,
right? Yeah, they would have had to have told him that God had a purpose, that he
yeah,
was different from all the others because they're drinking wine and eating grapes, and he can't,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
or at least he doesn't feel like he can. I
yeah,
don't know. Um,
yeah, yeah.
and
But
that probably gave him some license to do these things. Well, God's got a plan for me. I'm consecrated from before I was born, so
exactly.
I
Yep.
can do what I want.
Yeah. 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 Not a good
He
idea
just seemed
sometimes.
he seemed very just cocky and
Hmm.
just
Yeah.
definitely had an anger problem.
Right.
Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Um, Mom touched on something very, very poignant, though. Uh, the whole book of Judges, from the very first chapter, we see the Israelites messing up. And
Yeah.
God lets them, they turn to other gods, or they do something against God's will, and God lets them be taken over by somebody. The Ephraimites, or not the no, the Ephraimites are God's people. Excuse me, the Hittites, the Ammonites, all those ites, come in and rule the Israelites, um, as punishment. And then when they cry out to God, God forgives them and sends a judge to get rid of whoever it is that's oppressing them. And this has happened numerous times. I can't remember how many judges we've studied so far. I believe there's 12 in the entire book. We're on probably 8 or 9, somewhere in there. And that's the sole purpose of having a judge, to save the Israelite people from their oppression. God's willing to forgive in every circumstance, which is that's perfect. What she said, that God is still willing to forgive, and now we have the grace of Jesus that lets us, the grace through Jesus that lets us be forgiven today. Anything else? Next week, we do study the story of Samson and Delilah, and we will conclude Samson's story. So go ahead and read chapter 16 this week. I know we're a little shorter than usual. No, we still went about 45 minutes, pretty close. But anyway, if there is nothing else for the greater good, I'm at least going to stop the video